and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Welcome to Point of View. Thanks so much for being with me here today. We are going to have a great roundtable discussion talking about politics, culture, faith, world affairs, you name it. And if you want to follow along with the topics or read any of the articles that we mentioned, because we have several good ones for you, go to pointofview.net and you can read everything that we're talking about. You can read more about my fellow panelists who I'll be introducing here in a moment. And you can just stay connected with us that way. But let me introduce who I have on the phone this hour. First up, Jonathan Teague. He is the North Campus pastor of Prestonwood Baptist Church, a longtime friend of Point of View. And Jonathan, it's been a while since you and I have been on this show together, so it's great to have you on Point of View again.
Yeah, Liberty, it's great to be back and great to be with you. Looking forward to today's conversation.
Yes, me too. And then we also have this hour, Will Barclay. I think at this point, Will, I'm just going to start calling you our resident Canadian here on the roundtable for Point of View. But you are a political theorist, private consultant, always have such great perspectives on the cultural and political trends affecting Western civilization at large. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you all for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
So I want to jump in to a recent study that actually came out here in the U.S., and then I think it is actually going to connect to an article that Will has recently published, and so we'll make those connections or try to here in a little bit. But U.S. churchgoers are increasingly ambivalent about family and abortion. This comes from Dr. George Barna, Director of Research at the Cultural Center Research Center, and we look at a lot of the Barna research. He is always has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in the Christian culture in general. And what is concerning to me about this, and I'll start with you, Jonathan, as a pastor, is that when it comes to certain things that, at least in my perspective, from a biblical worldview, should be fairly clear in terms of the way that God ordered the family structure and the value of innocent human life, there's a surprising amount of ambiguity when you poll church-going Americans, and not people who go to church a couple times a year. We're talking about regular church attendees. So before I dive into too many details, Jonathan, your initial reactions to this report.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I do think it's good whenever, especially in context of local church ministry, Liberty, whenever we can have a great perspective into the thinking and the mindset of certainly every generation, but definitely the younger generations in particular. I mean, we've been saying to our church now for some weeks, especially since the assassination of Charlie Kirk and all that's resulted from that tragedy, the reality is people are, I think, very spiritually engaged. I think they are paying attention, and that is a wonderful thing. It's a really important thing. And in fact, I even said this in a message on Sunday. Bible sales are up. Religious, spiritual podcasting is up. Spiritual, even Christian music is up on Spotify. All that engagement is up. And what that means is, in particular, younger people, who it's logical to assume that's where they're engaging in those digital spaces, even in printed Bible sales, younger people are thinking about spiritual things. But it simultaneously reveals, I think, two things. One, a massive biblical literacy gap in the younger generations of our culture. That's an opportunity for pastors and preachers and seminaries and teachers, but it is a challenge. And so I think when we talk about just the realities of the construct of biblical family, biblical marriage, generally typically agreed upon worldview positions over the last 50 years of evangelicals around things like abortion. Now the younger generations, not saying they don't believe that. I think what some of that is revealing that they don't know how, or more particularly, they don't know where in the scripture to take that and then apply it. And I'm not saying that there's a spiritual ignorance there. I think there's just simply a biblical literacy gap. So it's an opportunity for pastors and preachers, and we need to pay close attention to it.
Yeah. Very, very good point. So just for some clarity for anyone listening, thinking, okay, well, what is the study showing us? When it comes to the family, survey participants were given several different choices or options to describe basically how they defined family. And one of those included a family to be a group of people united by God's design, a man and a woman married to each other, plus their children and relatives. But only actually less than half of church-going adults chose that view of family. When you looked at Gen Z, and Jonathan, you make good points about how spiritually hungry Gen Z is, and they are actually attending church at higher rates than older generations, but they are more likely, at least according to these statistics, to have their view of what makes a family influenced by what's popular in the culture. And if they're coming from the culture and that's where they've received their information about the world up to this point, that doesn't really, I guess it's not that surprising. But when it comes to abortion, I think I was probably a little more surprised because out of 73% of ongoing or regular churchgoers actually hold inconsistent opinions about abortion. Only half of church-going adults estimated that their church addressed the issue in at the space of 1 year. But we know that 1 in 4 women have dealt with this issue intimately. And so it's something that is definitely more prevalent in our culture that I think maybe a lot of people are dealing with, but it's not necessarily being addressed in the pulpit. So a couple minutes left in the segment, Jonathan. So I'll kick it to you and then get some of Will's thoughts when we come back from the break.
Well, and I think, Liberty, how you've teed that up is exactly the issue. So it's a priority. It needs to become a priority principle for younger pastors as our generation, guys my age and younger, step into a place of leadership and influence through preaching and teaching. It just reveals the reality, the really critical reality that, one, we've got to be tender and thoughtful and aware of who's sitting in our rooms. And the reality of those kind of statistics, I was having a conversation about this the other day with folks involved in our Preston Pregnancy Center. I talked about this. And our senior pastor, Dr. Graham, has talked about this for years. But so it's not just about pointing out the issue, but then speaking to it, shepherding people towards it, and being willing to accept where they are, where those questions are, what they know or don't know, and then keep speaking with clarity, keep speaking with truth. And there is a way, Liberty, I think, for us to do that where the gospel's offensive, but it doesn't have to be unnecessarily harsh, and it never is. The gospel is always tender and meets us where we are. But we can't retreat from what we know is most true. And that's going to be an opportunity window that'll stay open, I think, for a little while longer with Gen Z. And if we leverage it well, if we steward it well, I think that's where this awakening will extend beyond just a moment, because I really do believe that's what we're seeing, and it'll extend into a longer runway of faithfulness for this generation as they get married and as they raise their families.
Yeah, great points. Well, we're about to go to a break, but don't forget you can read this report for yourself at pointofview.net. And let me just point out, too, that we send out weekly Pray for America emails. And so you can go to the website and sign up for those. Tomorrow's prayer target is actually some of the issues raised in this report in terms of equipping the local church and equipping more mature Christians to be able to step into those discipleship roles and meet the younger people who are hungry for truth right where they are, but be able to give those answers and actually articulate and explain what the Bible teaches about these things. But when we come back from the break, let's turn to a recent article by Will Barclay, who's with us today on Point of View. His article is titled "The Conservative, Canada's Most Openly Oppressed Minority." So we'll talk more about how conservatives are being oppressed in Canada and what that means right after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Columnist John Funn warns that open letters from experts are often fact-free propaganda. We talked about his column in a recent roundtable discussion on radio to encourage listeners to use discernment and be skeptical of such devices. The occasion for his column was the question of whether the president could fire a sitting member of the Federal Reserve who was accused of committing mortgage fraud. He argues this shouldn't be controversial, but pointed to an open letter signed by academics who stated that she should stay on the job. He mentioned a study done by 2 economists that detailed the dismal record of fact-free open letters. For example, these experts predicted that the federal student loan program would make money for the government, that Obamacare would dramatically reduce health care costs, and that redistribution and using more costly energy sources would increase economic growth. Last year, several Nobel Prize winners endorsed the tax and spend proposals by Kamala Harris over the plan for Donald Trump. He concludes that such letters are often theatrical versions of political position papers rather than any attempt to educate the public. That's no surprise, he says, because they often come from highly liberal tenured professors who, shocker alert, oppose all conservative policies. Although he was merely focusing on open letters about economics, we don't want to forget the 51 former intelligence officers who signed a public letter suggesting that the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop had the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. We know that was wrong. The lesson is clear. We all should be skeptical when reading these open letters, since many of them are indeed fact-free propaganda. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. So we were just talking about a recent report from Dr. George Barna, specifically looking at what trends we're seeing among regular church-going adults in the United States with regard to family, beliefs about family, and beliefs about the sanctity of life. And by the way, there is going to be a part 2 of that report that is released soon. So I'm sure we'll be talking about that here on Point of View, but it might be something to look out for. But kind of zooming out a little bit, Will, I know when we talk about Western civilization in general, if you go back just a few decades or a century, there were a lot of beliefs, regardless of maybe kind of theological hair splitting, that were mainstream, traditional beliefs about family, about morality, that were based in a pretty common worldview. But in just the last few decades, we've seen those beliefs, some of which we were talking about in the last segment, go from being mainstream to now being labeled as extremist and actually seeing people persecuted for holding those beliefs. And I think that this is some of maybe what's happening in Canada, and you document that in your latest article. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and feel free to talk about what you write here for the Western Standard.
Thank you so much. You hit the nail on the head as always. Basically, all right-wing ideology and every conservative has become persecuted and pressed in Canada over the course of the past liberal decade. Very much since the advent of the Trudeau era in 2015, left-wing pundits throughout Canada have mimicked their American counterparts and consistently deployed populism and populist as catch-all terms for all right-wing ideology and every conservative. Now, unfortunately, they've also labored tirelessly in order to transform populism into a euphemism for neo-Nazis and tyrants, as well as all species of bigot, in a vain attempt to really silo all conservative ideology under the false veneer of fascism and discredit the surge in popularity that all right-wing ideology, values, and leaders have enjoyed in Canada, and very much threats the international political system post-Trump. In contrast, what we've seen is the left-wing political edifices and media organizations that currently preside over Canadian society. Well, they've hailed all left-wing ideology as the driver of all socio-political progress since the Enlightenment, and then invariably associated with a left-wing ethos with the democratic ideal and human rights, right? And so as a result, what we've seen is they've engineered a political spectrum wherein a person or a political actor becomes increasingly evil and very much antithetical to democracy, in as much as their political beliefs and personal ideology becomes progressively conservative or populist. And conversely, they become good and virtuous in as much as their personal beliefs become left-wing and liberal. And so what we've seen is the political discourse in Canada has collapsed. Canadians are being subsumed within this political ecosystem wherein every right-wing ideology is not merely a competing ethos, but rather inherently evil and explicitly dangerous to the well-being of any democracy, and therefore very much an enemy that has to be eradicated and destroyed along with its adherents. And so what we've seen is that open persecution has become very much a macabre reality of daily life for every conservative in Canada. And maybe I think probably the most chilling aspect of it is that there's very much a state-sponsored element to all this. I mean, the government has literally violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in its efforts to oppress conservatives, and now it actually seeks to enact new powers for itself via the legislation like the Combating Hate Act to do more of the same. I think nearly half of all Canadian university students are actively actually concealing their real opinions on campus out of fear of sanction or mistreatment. I think, like, at the end of the day, every Canadian who doesn't worship at the altar of liberalism or ascribe to the gospel of identity politics has to agree. Anti-conservative hate crimes, they very much become the most enduring legacy of the Liberal era. And Canada's national ruin has very much come right along with it.
Yeah, you had said so many good things there. And I think one of the things that is very evident to me is that we oftentimes, or at least in media and culture, what is secular or non-religious is seen as being neutral. But in reality, what has happened is that secularism itself and now left-wing ideology in a lot of places has actually become the new religion, which is why they can say, as you said, anybody who leans to the right of the political spectrum in their beliefs is inherently evil, and do not have the right to argue their point of view. There is no, marketplace of ideas for those people who hold those views because they are just seen as anathema. So, Jonathan, I'd love to get your take on this too, just kind of culturally speaking. I think that we are seeing some of this in the United States as well, where people who do have a certain political belief or even a certain religious viewpoint have really, and I think this is kind of reversing in the United States, thankfully, but for a long time, really felt all of a sudden that they were being labeled as hateful and extremist, and these are beliefs that they and their tradition had held for millennia.
Yeah, and this is a part of what's happening, Liberty, and just to what's been said already, one of the things that I'm really thankful for in our church is we have something called the Prestonwood Network, which is a community of several hundred pastors stretched out all across North America and beyond who are like-minded in church planting and making disciples and preaching the gospel. And one of those is a dear brother in Quebec. And some of what was just being shared, I've heard these stories directly from my friend, and direct intervention around worship service times and locations, and working with local communities and cities to have footprints for people to come to have church, and being displaced with little to no warning, and having to go find a variety of places to go have church. And it's eye-opening. And William, I appreciate so much what you're saying there. And these are my friends, guys that are faithful pastors, and they're saying the same thing. And to what degree, Liberty, is it foreshadowing for what we'll see within the U.S. in the days to come? But I think progressive ideology is bent on the idea that pluralism is king. And the problem with that is that pluralism always eats itself. And so at the end of the day, all our truths can't all be equally valid. Eventually, someone is going to supersede their truth with my truth, and it's going to be in conflict. And so the ability to navigate that in the public square, and while we still have it in America, having the freedom to express that openly in our religion in the public square is huge. But I do think it does signal the reality that there is an ideological bent towards that not being the case. It is real, it is active, it is funded, and it is aggressive. So Christians just need to be understanding of that. They need to be prepared for that, and they need to be able to speak in season, out of season, as the scripture says, be able to give a defense for the gospel.
Yeah, well said. Will, what is the response? Obviously, you're being very vocal about this, but are there kind of rumblings of people saying we're going to stand up against this or try to do what we can to reclaim freedom in this area? Are you seeing that among young conservatives in Canada, or what's kind of happening there on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that very much the public execution of Charlie Kirk did act as a catalyst to mobilize a lot of young Canadians. I know that despite the fact that young Canadians are very much afraid to articulate their beliefs, like the data shows on campus, the beliefs are there, and they are seeking, let's say, alternative spaces and modes of political expression in order to articulate these beliefs and very much kind of stand up for what they believe to be right. I think that we can even look to see in Canada nowadays the Alberta secession movement, right? It's become a huge thing, lots of support. I think you could say that is almost completely a response to this this oppression of right-wing ideology and conservatives in Canada. I don't think that you get the secessionist movement in Alberta without the decade of liberal oppression that precedes it. Even the Freedom Convoy, I think, as much as it was certainly an outcome of COVID and the dire situation that did happen in Canada, I think, again, you don't get the Freedom Convoy without, again, that decade of liberal oppression and very much the suppression of any free speech outside of those liberal margins in Canada. I think also maybe what we could say is that the left is very much in Canada and everywhere has long rejected this notion of objective truth and excised any a priori unwavering good and evil from their political discourse. And in doing so, it's left modern leftists, utterly bereft of any true meaning. And so they constantly struggle to imbue their lives with purpose. And so in a lot of ways, they're almost forced to insert conflict into their lives and their existence, right? I think that they're doomed in a way to continue sporadically erupting into violence and angst almost in an effort to once more imbue their lives with a modicum of meaning until they, again, embrace the fact that there is an a priori good and a priori evil and truth. And to deny it is very much to kind of doom yourself.
Yeah, that is so on point. And again, I think it's why, and you said it, the assassination of Charlie Kirk has served as a catalyst for so many young people around the world. And because the evil is very evident. And so it's really hard to say that there's no absolute truth and there's no absolute morality when you are faced with evil that is undeniable. And then I think a lot of young people are starting to ask those questions, which goes back to even what we talked about at the top of the hour. Sometimes there's moral confusion there, and that's where discipleship comes in, but people are seeking that truth. So be praying for Canada, be watching what's happening, and as always, speak up and be bold, defend free speech, defend the rights that we have here in the United States, because we cannot take them for granted. But when we come back from the break, let's talk about an article from the Free Press. You can go ahead and look at it if you want at pointofview.net. It's called The Foolishness of No Enemies to the Right by Seth Dillon. He leads the Babylon Bee. So we'll talk about that article when we get back in a few moments.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Just a few moments ago, we were talking about Will Barclay's article in which he was detailing how in Canada, anybody who leans right in their political ideology has been subject to names like Nazi, extremist. We've seen this in the United States as well. Democrats have called their counterparts Nazis, neo-Nazis, fascists. And when these things clearly are not true, and ironically, sometimes they are the ones more acting like fascists. But then you have a segment of the far right that is actually embracing some of those labels. And so Seth Dillon's argument, he is the CEO of the Babylon Bee, which if you're not familiar with that, it's like the conservative onion, okay? It's satire. He has written in the Free Press saying that we shouldn't say no enemies to the right. We should be able to call out bad ideas that are on the right just as much as we call out bad ideas that are on the left. And I think that this is a really important point to make because I think it's important for the movement. I think if we don't do this, which is Seth's argument as well, then we will end up at the same place that they are now. So, Jonathan, let me get your thoughts on this. Do you agree with what Seth is writing? And how do you see kind of this trend toward not criticizing anybody who's also on the right wing of the political spectrum?
Well, I think one of the rules of being a mature Christian, Liberty, is that you are never above scrutiny. And I think a great virtue of the Christian life, and Jesus speaks about this in Matthew 5, is your willingness to be humble and meek. And a lot of times what I've described that as humility is my ability to teach you something absent of arrogance, and meekness is the ability to be taught something at the absence of sort of a prideful bitterness. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us that care about advancing the message of the gospel and in winning the hearts and minds of the people in our culture, ultimately with the name of Jesus and the truth of his word. If there are instances where somebody, a little bit to Seth's point here, if there are instances where somebody overindulges that worldview beyond what it teaches, beyond the framework of what the scripture says, where it becomes antagonistic or certainly ungodly, if I ever became that way, I would expect my closest friends to control that, right? To step in and to hold me accountable. There's a James 5 imperative there. Peter and Paul have this moment. Paul talks about this in Galatians, where Paul confronts Peter on an issue where there's growth that needs to happen. I think maybe there's a spirit of that a little bit, but I think it speaks to the reticence that some folks have to be able to speak into or to speak towards someone who generally, from a, I guess, lack of a better words, tribal perspective, maybe is trying to advance a similar message, whether it be conservative or otherwise. There's a reticence there to maybe police one another because it's like, hey, let's let it ride. Well, that's never really wise in the long run, because what needs to prevail is the truth of the message, and that truth needs to be what drives how we help one another stay within the boundaries of what that truth teaches.
Yeah. So here's another quote from the article. This is from Seth Dillon. Whenever I criticize the bad ideas on our side, anti-Semitism, historically illiterate revisionism, baseless conspiracy theories, authoritarian impulses, a mob forms to accuse me of treachery and betrayal. I'm attacked for punching right, dividing the movement, and hurting the cause. So, Will, we were just talking about the oppression of people who identify as conservatives in Canada. And so I can understand how when you are faced with what seems like, state-sponsored oppression and evil against your ideology, it can be hard to say, well, we shouldn't, we don't want to police our own side. But what are your thoughts on this? Do we need to be able to speak up against people on our own side of the movement whenever they are also leaning into things that are not healthy?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I understand kind of the counterpoint, like the kernel of truth that kind of underlies on or what they're going for, the solidarity in the movement and all this kind of stuff like this. But I completely agree with what you're saying. I think there are 5 fingers on God's right hand. The most oft ignored is justice. I think that just because someone is close to you ideologically, even if they're your family, even though it pains you, you obviously don't get to give them some free pass or excuse to act immorally or wrongly. It flies in the face of some of the most fundamental biblical principles. Judge everyone justly and fairly. And what I would say, though, is that the right does overwhelmingly do this. We take ownership for actions and their consequences, and that's a big difference. We have only really to look at the responses that's ensued after the recently leaked text message, I think it's from the Young Republicans, I think it was.
Yes.
The response from the right was immediate and emphatic. The racism and bigotry was completely disavowed and condemned, and the appropriate measures were taken. What didn't happen, though, is everyone on the right didn't immediately contort themselves and indulge in mental gymnastics in order to explain why it wasn't wrong or find some way to not condemn it. But that is exactly what happened. I think it was Jay Jones, the guy on the left, I think it is, who's recently revealed to be fantasizing about killing Republicans and leveraging political violence against the innocent in order to achieve his own political agenda. Well, it's very hard to find a Democrat or leftist that will actually disavow that. And I mean, we talk all the time about holding ourselves to a higher standard. In a way, I think it's easy because the left, by their own definition, well, they have no standards, right? We were just talking about this. They've disavowed all objective truth and good. There are no objective standards, right? And so how can you hold yourself to a standard when the goalposts are always moving?
Yeah, that's such a great point. How can you hold somebody to a standard when there is no standard? And you're right, and we're going to talk about this in more depth in the next hour, but I actually have an article on this on the website today, how Democrats are actually doubling down in support of Jay Jones, who is currently the Democratic nominee for Attorney General of Virginia, who has actually texted wishing for the death of his Republican counterparts and their children, saying that they should be shot. And no Democrat, or at least none of consequence, most recently Senator Tim Kaine, who was previously a vice presidential candidate, came out doubling down on his support, saying, no, I am not going to withdraw my support of Jay Jones. And one of the points that Seth makes in this article from the Free Press is that this is the problem of the left, and this is how they have gotten so out of touch with Americans, is that they have just, there has been no standard, there has been no, hey, whoa, you're pushing that too far. It has just been support, everything on the left because the right is the ultimate enemy. And I think then that, again, that's why it's so important to be held to standards, like you said, Will, principles, actual truth, because our loyalty isn't to one side of the political spectrum, it's to truth. And if we find ourselves on the right, then that's because, or aligned with a particular party, because that party or that movement is most closely aligned with truth, not because we're trying to be ultimately aligned with that movement or that party. So, yeah, I think you make a good point, Will, that the right does do a better job of this. But, Jonathan, I think we are seeing some pressure. Maybe this has been heightened. Maybe there's a sense of fear, especially after everything with Charlie Kirk, where people are, especially maybe younger people, hesitant to, again, call out those on the right just because they do see how bad it's getting on the left. And I wonder if maybe that's a fear response rather than a biblical response. And a couple minutes left before the end of the segment.
No, it absolutely is. And to Will's point, so, just to highlight what's already been said, one of the other realities of progressive ideology is at the end of the day, it's predicated on the idea of a synthetic synergy, meaning what we're looking for is as much antagonism. I mean, this is just reality. It is inherently an antagonistic perspective. And the Christian worldview comes from the perspective of the protagonist. So God created people in his image. He loves us. He has a great plan for our life. It begins by accepting the truth of the gospel of what Jesus did for us at the cross. God is in the business of saving people. The Christian message and the message of Jesus is no doubt originated from the heart of a God who is just and righteous and merciful and holy, and yet provided his son as a substitute for our place. So if you draft within that worldview through the lens of the Scripture, then what you're not trying to do is constantly antagonize your neighbors. You're not trying to antagonize the people around you. We're certainly, Ephesians 6 says, Liberty, we are absolutely to go about the business of spiritual warfare, but it also says it's not against flesh and blood, it's against principalities in the spiritual realm. What does that mean? It means I'm called to love my neighbor, to reach out to them, to speak Jesus to them, and stand for truth for sure, unapologetically and without fear, and win the hearts of the people in my city for the gospel. Progressive ideology is the opposite. It's meant to antagonize a monolithic, monotheistic worldview. That's the core of what it is. It's that pluralism we talked about earlier. And so I think you're seeing the disparity now of the worldviews. And really, you're seeing how different both are. And I think I just look at this from the lens of a pastor. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to shine a light in my city. That's my goal. And I think the message of the gospel, it's one that is going to require conviction and courage to stand on truth. We cannot be afraid to call out what's right and what's wrong, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, and to stand for what that truth leads us to say. And that may mean it's going to cost you. It may mean that you may receive threat, violence. You may even receive death. But the reality is we're called to give all of ourselves for Jesus. And a lost and dying world needs to hear the clarity of that message, not the chaos of constant political antagonism and disagreement.
Yeah, so well said. We need to stand for truth and stand for the gospel. And if we don't stand on that, then what are we standing on? But we have some more to discuss after this short break, so stay with us right here on Point of View.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, so far this hour, I've been joined by Jonathan Teague and Will Barclay, and we've been having some great conversations. If you've missed any of them or you want to go back and dig a little bit deeper, remember you can go to pointofview.net and click on all the articles that we've discussed today, and you can also catch anything you've missed in podcast format after the broadcast. So you can find Point of View Radio Talk Show on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts. But let's talk about Israel for the last few minutes of this hour. Vice President J.D. Vance went to Israel. So just yesterday, he was actually imploring everybody to be praying for the peace deal. Here's one quote, "And I know that Christians have many titles for Jesus Christ, and one of them is the Prince of Peace. And I'd ask people of all faith, all people of faith, and in particular my fellow Christians, to pray that the Prince of Peace can continue to work a miracle in this region of the world." So when the initial deal was accepted, many people were saying, okay, that's kind of a miracle. People said that President Trump should receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Obviously, there is a lot left to unfold to see if this will stick. And so Vice President Vance said that he's not there to babysit the deal, but they are emphasizing that Hamas needs to behave. So one of the things we saw after the deal is that Hamas began executing Palestinians in Gaza who had, I guess, were accused of working with Israel or cooperating with Israel, which isn't surprising because anybody who thought that they actually cared about the safety of their own people, then they were taken in by the propaganda because Hamas has never actually cared. And I think that we're seeing that now. But Will, I'll turn to you. Feel free to make any comments on the peace deal. How do you see things as they're unfolding and hope for the future in this really important thing that is happening right now in the Middle East?
Okay, I'm going to make a couple of quick points, and then I'll get into something a little bit more in depth. First, I just think the word peace, shalom in Hebrew, is a very interesting word, right? When we think of peace in English, it's almost a restful state, right? But in Hebrew, the word peace or shalom is an active, dynamic thing, a state where everything is fulfilled and being everything kind of perfect, being perfectly, right? So it's a very dynamic state, right? And I think that's transformative when we think about peace, so to speak, in the Middle East and in the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's not a restful state. It's a dynamic thing where everybody, all the actors are constantly at work, so to speak. I think the other point that I'd make is that we're not talking about peace, funny enough. We're talking about a ceasefire, and it's become evidently clear, right? I mean, like the only reason that it persists is because the Israel and the Jewish nation do want peace, whereas Hamas does not. And so we've arrived at this thing called a ceasefire, right, where they've agreed to stop killing each other and shooting each other for the time being, but it's certainly not peace. But the major point that I would point out, and I think you again, like, hit the nail on the head, is that Gazans themselves are sick of Hamas. I think that the fact of the matter is that every last Jew could vanish into the sea alongside the state of Israel, and yet until Hamas has been thoroughly decimated and exiled from Gaza, the Palestinian people will still remain brutally oppressed and at the hands of their compatriots. I mean, Hamas routinely embezzles the overwhelming majority of any international aid and funding simply in order to enrich its senior officials and viciously attack the people of Israel. I think it's 55% of its budget goes to its military needs and less than 5% towards the rehabilitation of Gaza. I mean, it's so bad that in 2020, years before this current outbreak of the conflict, over 60% of all the households in the Gaza Strip were moderately or severely food insecure. And I mean, like I was saying, the Palestinian people themselves have recognized this long ago. They recognize that Hamas is the source of their problems, not Israel. Air Barometer, the longest running and most comprehensive public opinion project in the Middle East, has confirmed that 67% of Gazans are deeply distressed from Hamas, and 72% of Gazans believe that Hamas and its government institutions are overwhelmingly corrupt. I mean, we've already had huge anti-Hamas protests erupt throughout Gaza in March and April, and Hamas murdered people then too. I mean, at the end of the day, countless self-styled Palestinian allies throughout North America, although they continue to regurgitate this tattered narrative that the state of Israel must be abolished in order for the Palestinian people to be free, well, it's readily apparent that anyone who earnestly seeks to help or liberate the Palestinian people, well, they have to strive to confront Hamas and expel its extremist blight from the Palestinian territories, not abort the state of Israel or exterminate the Jewish people.
You know what? If anyone listening has people in their life that are struggling to see through the pro-Hamas propaganda, I would say send them the podcast of this and have them listen to what Will just said, because the facts and statistics that you shared are what I wish so many people would actually learn and pay attention to. And it's just so important. But unfortunately, that is not the narrative, at least that we've seen here in the U.S., that people have bought into, unfortunately. Jonathan, in the last few minutes of this hour, your reactions to what's going on in Israel.
Well, I think Will's assessment is just absolutely spot on. I think it's also equally wonderful that we have a vice president that knows that one of the monikers of Jesus is the Prince of Peace. I just leave that there. I think that's just another aspect of the evidence that we're living in a fascinating and exciting moment in the world. And I think that there is a version, a variation of a framework of a peace arrangement in Israel is essential. We need to stand with Israel, and for our church and many like-minded evangelical churches, that needs to be the disposition overwhelmingly, that we stand with Israel, and at the same time advocate for peace in that region of the world, which has never come easy over multiple millennia. But it's essential, and I do think what Will's saying is right, and beyond that too, I think it's just, again, Liberty, just to stay on theme here, if I could. I mean, this is another example where progressivism, the insanity of hyper-progressivism is rampant in situations like this, where if you take a pro-Hamas view, you are absolutely agreeing with the eradication and extermination of a people group. You are absolutely promoting, you are standing with violence and terror, and the fact that a deal has been effectively brokered here. And I'm really proud of our administration, and I'm really proud of President Trump for his willingness to take the lead on this globally. But you're still seeing that Hamas is simply unwilling, it looks like, to both abide by the tenets of the peace deal and therefore for it to be prolonged. That's sad. And again, it speaks to the inherent evil of what terror and terrorism is and what it does, and why it's very simply, and again, this is just to download this here, Liberty, this is another example where pastors and leaders within these spaces simply need to speak up and say, that's wrong. It's not biblical, and it's wrong. And we need to stand with and support Israel, and we need to pray for peace in that region. And where the government and right-minded governments need to step in and help adjudicate justice, so be it. But this simply must happen, and there must be peace in Israel, and Hamas must abide by the peace treaty. And if it's not going to do it, then we need to examine appropriate measures.
Yeah, absolutely. Such wisdom for both of you, Jonathan and Will. And Jonathan, I really liked what you pointed out too about the meaning of shalom, and that is dynamic. It is active, and so. Obviously, we pray for that kind of peace in those who hold positions of power that actually have influence in the peace deal and the ceasefire and the future of that region. But also, we can actively work to make peace here. And you can't have peace, you can't have true shalom without truth. And so, as Jonathan was saying, being willing to speak up about those issues and do so from a place of love and actually educating people on what the truth is so important. And that's a way that we can contribute to the peacemaking process. So, Will and Jonathan, it's been great having you both on Point of View this hour. You can find their information, and I definitely recommend that you do that by going to pointofview.net, and you can see their full biographies there and links for any other resources that they have or following the work that they do. And you can, again, go and catch up on any articles that we discussed this hour. And again, I would share this segment, share the podcast later with people who are confused about the Israel-Palestine thing, because, man, there was a lot of wisdom shared from Jonathan and Will just in the last few minutes. But don't go anywhere, because when we come back, we will have more to discuss with Stephen Mosley and Alyssa Sonnenburg on the Point of View Roundtable. So stay with us, and we'll be back in just a few moments.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net. or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things. So the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Thanks for being with us on the Roundtable today. Let's talk about what's happening in Virginia. But first, I want to introduce my co-hosts for this hour, Stephen Mosley and Alyssa Sonnenburg. Both of you, thank you so much for being on Point of View today.
Thanks for having us.
So Stephen Mosley is a college administrator and school choice advocate, and you've heard his wife, Patrina Mosley, on the Roundtable as well. And Alyssa Sonnenburg works with Illinois Family Institute and is the host, writer, and manager of the Self-Evident podcast. So I do want to remind people that you can follow along with what we're talking about at pointofview.net, and you can find this article. It was originally published with the Washington Stand and reprinted with the Daily Signal. Democrats double down on scandal-ridden Jay Jones ahead of Virginia elections. So if you haven't seen this in the news, the Democratic nominee for Attorney General of Virginia, who is Jay Jones, had some text messages go public in which he wished for the death of Republicans and a Republican's children. And the Democrats did not respond by calling for him to be to step down from the race or removing their support. They're actually doubling down. Most recently, Senator Tim Kaine, also former vice presidential candidate, has said, and here's what really blows my mind, that the quotes from the text from Jay Jones, which are truly vile. So just to kind of give you an idea, if you haven't read these, this is back when he was serving in the Virginia House of Delegates. He was texting about Speaker of the House at the time, Todd Gilbert, who was a Republican, and said that he deserved 2 bullets to the head and other things I can't say on the radio, and actually said that his children should be shot so that Republicans would reconsider their position on the Second Amendment. And this is right. This is all coming public right after, obviously, the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk. And Democrats are supporting him still. And so Kaine, Senator Tim Kaine, said that what Jones said, what I just read you, is directly equivalent to things that the Republican gubernatorial candidate has publicly said. And he's referring to Virginia Winsome Earl Spears, the governor of Virginia, Winsome Earl Sears, and the GOP nominee for governor of Virginia. And she's pro-life. So she had said that murder is murder, talking about the murder of innocent unborn children. And he's equating that to Jay Jones' text messages calling for the murder of Republicans and their children. So that, I mean, even for somebody who is pro-choice, that seems totally disingenuous to equate those two. But Stephen, if I'm not mistaken, you're actually in Virginia. So give us your take. There's a lot happening. There's a lot going on right now.
I like to hear that Lieutenant Governor Sears is Governor Sears. So I loved it when you said that. So yes, hopefully prophetic. We will see that in a couple of weeks. Yes. Here's the thing. This is a habit of Democrats. They just double down, triple down, quadruple down because they know if they win an election after it, that becomes a new norm. And so with Jay Jones, the bigger thing here, the media's making a big issue about this text message, which is important, right? But I also want to point out, Jay Jones, or as I call him, 100-Mile Jay, he also has an issue of driving too fast. Now, this guy wants to oversee all the laws in the state of Virginia, but he can't obey the laws in the state of Virginia. That's the bigger issue here. He is unqualified for this job. I loved when Jason Miyares, who's our current Attorney General, and hopefully still will be our Attorney General, after this election, he pointed out that Jay couldn't even get a job in the Attorney General office now to pass the background check. So I'm like, listen, people, we can't have this. And I'll admit, I'm partisan. As a Christian and as a conservative, I'm partisan here. I have stakes here in Virginia. I live here in Virginia. This is a passionate issue. But as a Christian who would not be partisan, someone who says, I'm not from Virginia, why should I care? You should care about a couple of things. One, after the death of Charlie Kirk, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we have to realize that our words have power in them and that we have to be more careful with them. And I am appreciative that Jay Jones came out and apologized for these text messages that were released. But what he needs to do is say, you know what? At this time, I need to resign because of the culture, because of the time. I think he's unqualified for the mere fact that he doesn't obey the laws of Virginia, but he wants to be the Attorney General. To me, that's what's disqualifying for him. But in this time, he also had these text messages released. Now, when you look at polling, Jason Miyares is up 5 points over Jay Jones. So if the election was held today, Jason Miyares would remain our Attorney General. And I think he'll probably still win this race, Jason Miyares. But I think as a Christian, what we need to say is, like, how are my words, even in private text messages? Because remember, these were private text messages. How are they honoring or not honoring to the Lord? And let's switch that and make sure that moving forward, they are honoring to Jesus.
Yeah, that's so wise. Alyssa, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, my initial reaction to this story was I found it darkly ironic that the same party that trumps the idea that speech is violence and promoted that idea as justification for people that were celebrating the dark assassination of Charlie Kirk. That's the same party that is looking at these text messages from Jones and saying, no, it's fine. You're misunderstanding what he's saying, or he has a good point that Republicans need to be more watchful when it comes to the abortion issue, whatever justifications they're giving, that it should be apparent to everyone, but unfortunately it's not, that this idea that is parroted by the left that speech is violence, one, is not true, but also that threatening someone's life is vastly different from just stating political opinions, like abortion is murder and things like that.
Amen.
Yeah, that is so true. It really seems like a case of grace and forgiveness for me, but not for thee. And we have seen the argument that speech is violence, which, as you point out, that's not the case. We're all about free speech. That doesn't mean, though, just in the real world, that you can be irresponsible with your speech and that there won't be consequences. You should have the freedom to speak, but that doesn't mean that maybe you should be qualified for that and other reasons to run for a prominent government position. And I also think, to Stephen's point, this is really a wake-up call. I mean, really, just on a very pragmatic sense, nothing we do is truly private. And I think that people need to realize that, as millennials, I know that I was told, don't post everything on Facebook because what's on the internet is forever. And I don't think our parents really understood how right they were with that. But even today, I mean, we are seeing all kinds of revelations from private messages, private texts, but even more so, it shouldn't be about self-preservation. I think, Stephen, you're so right. We need to really ask ourselves and do some soul searching. Am I saying this because I don't think it matters who's watching right now? Or am I really saying this and watching my words because it's the right thing to do and because it honors God? And it's actually consistent with what I say that I believe about God and about other people and about the value of life. So I think it's a reminder for all of us to be consistent with our speech, whether in private or public. And I do think that it exposes some hypocrisy on the left, especially after everything that we've seen. So when we come back from the break, which we're about to go to, I do want to talk about another article. This one's from the New Guard Press, talking about our cold civil war. Obviously, the nation is extremely divided, so we're going to talk about that, and you can read along with us at pointofview.net. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Columnist John Fund warns that open letters from experts are often fact-free propaganda. We talked about his column in a recent roundtable discussion on radio to encourage listeners to use discernment and be skeptical of such devices. The occasion for his column was the question of whether the president could fire a sitting member of the Federal Reserve who was accused of committing mortgage fraud. He argues this shouldn't be controversial, but pointed to an open letter signed by academics who stated that she should stay on the job. He mentioned a study done by two economists that detailed the dismal record of fact-free open letters. For example, these experts predicted that the federal student loan program would make money for the government, that Obamacare would dramatically reduce health care costs, and that redistribution and using more costly energy sources would increase economic growth. Last year, several Nobel Prize winners endorsed the tax and spend proposals by Kamala Harris over the plan for Donald Trump. He concludes that such letters are often theatrical versions of political position papers rather than any attempt to educate the public. That's no surprise, he says, because they often come from highly liberal tenured professors who, shocker alert, oppose all conservative policies. Although he was merely focusing on open letters about economics, we don't want to forget the 51 former intelligence officers who signed a public letter suggesting that the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop had the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. We know that was wrong. The lesson is clear. We all should be skeptical when reading these open letters, since many of them are indeed fact-free propaganda. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
So recently, many people have asked whether or not we're at a point in our nation where we're actually headed toward civil war. And this is because of the violence that we have seen, unfortunately. But what this article talks about is our cold civil war. Really, culture is divided, and there are some examples in this article that may seem trivial or non-consequential at first. For instance, the fact that there are basically going to be 2 halftime shows for the NFL Super Bowl this year. You're going to have the main one from the NFL featuring Bad Bunny. I'm assuming most people listening probably don't know who that is, and that's okay. And then Turning Point USA is going to host a family-friendly halftime show. And then things like movies. And really, you may think, okay, well, look, that's not that big of a deal. But what I think it is showing is that even outside of our politics, our culture is so divided. You can really go through your whole life at this moment in America and never watch the same shows or movies or watch the same news program or listen to the same radio program or podcasts that as somebody who has a different belief than you. There's really a lot less common ground, even just, with regard to pop culture, because we are becoming so siloed based on our values and beliefs and how pervasive politics is. So, Alyssa, I would love to get your take on this. What did you think of this assessment of a cold civil war? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agreed with the article. I believe we've been engaged in some kind of cultural civil war for a long time, but it brought it to the forefront at the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I think, for everyone involved, that one side of the aisle has been so radicalized that if you say different opinions, such as you should get married and have children, or abortion is murder, or men can't become women, that they have become so radical that they are willing to kill you. And that was a shocker, I think, for a lot of conservatives. I'm thinking specifically of Allie Beth Stuckey, who she shared in her tribute to Charlie Kirk that when she first heard the news that he had been shot and then that he had passed away, she was ready to give up podcasting. That it was a shock for her to see that we are no longer dealing with just talking points and having open discussions and battling out ideas in the public square, that it has become so violent and so stressed in this environment. And especially as a mom now, I'm looking out at the culture, and I honestly see so much divide that even little things such as Netflix subscription, that Netflix is allowing so much radical content for our children, and Elon Musk calling on conservatives to boycott Netflix. There's so little that I have in common with someone who is progressive, and it's really, really sad that we've gotten so divided.
Yeah, it is. And Stephen, I've always been of the mind, and this is as somebody who has friends that are longtime friends of different political viewpoints, that, has advocated for continuing to build those bridges to not stop being friends with someone or stop communicating with someone just because we hold different viewpoints. And I think that, again, trend-wise, you do see statistically more people on the left who are willing to cut people off over politics. But as Alyssa was saying, as a parent now, I'm becoming even more siloed in some ways in terms of media and just kind of places where you are doing life as a young family, because you do want your kids to be surrounded by truth. And so it's kind of, I think a lot of people are wrestling maybe, as Christians with, we want to continue to build those bridges. We want to reach out with people who disagree, but we're also trying to, really bolster our communities with truth right now. And that can seem harder and harder to do. So what are your thoughts?
We always need to be about evangelism. And I think that's really what the issue is, right? We're talking about how in our culture we used to be like, oh, we disagreed on politics, but we're still cool friends. And now we're at the point where no, we could disagree and you literally could die tomorrow as a conservative because the leftists are killing you. And it's because we forgot that we're in a spiritual battle. And as we see this secular sacred divide in the country, I think the article does a great job on the politics of it, showing here's where the right stands, here's where the left stands. They're two totally different places. And that's true. We should never downgrade that. That's true. When you watch our favorite news networks, they don't talk about the same thing anymore. It used to be in the early O's that your favorite news networks, whether it was the Fox News Channel or MSNBC, they told the same story just from a different perspective.
You're right.
Now when you watch news, it's like if you talk to your neighbor, they don't seem to understand the same stories you understand because they're not hearing the same things. Mm-hmm. Their values are different. And this is a secular sacred divide. So Christians, we believe in Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, which comes with different value points. And now the secular left, and even on the secular right, have different value points than we do. And so when we see events like this one, I think one of the big ones was in the NFL having 2 halftime shows, right? And it's the idea of I've been wanting the Gospel Music Association to do this forever, because it's not like the NFL halftime shows have been the most godly things ever.
Right.
They've always been pretty bad. And I think the real issue here as Christians is how are we as Christians making an alternative for that, that, as you mentioned, your children can have a safe thing to watch and not be exposed to sinful things before time. And also that we can be a shining light for the gospel. I think as adults, Christians, we need to continue to engage with our secular neighbors, but we need to understand that there is a spiritual warfare going on there and that these people need Jesus. And when they get Jesus and they're discipled in a Bible-believing church, their worldview and voting patterns will change. Until that point, that every other thing we try to do is not going to work, because this is a spiritual battle, not just a political one.
Yeah, Stephen, that is so true. And I think, Alyssa, that's why we've seen, you started to see this trend for a while, but especially after what happened to Charlie Kirk, a lot of members of Gen Z and really a lot of Americans in general going back to church for the first time. And maybe they're not exactly sure what that means or what they're seeking, but they are seeking an alternative. So I think that we have to provide that. We have to boldly, we can be loving, we can be kind, we can be willing to engage with our neighbors and our neighborhoods and have conversations with people, but really show the truth, because at some point people are going to realize that they need it and they need a place to turn to. But what are you seeing where you are with kind of that movement that we're kind of seeing reported on?
Right. Well, unfortunately, I live in a very liberal area. So for me, the shift that America is experiencing, Stephen, that America is experiencing is not so much felt in my area. If anything, I think it's bolstered people that already have the same opinions that we need to be bolder for Christ. And especially with the shift that we saw after Charlie Kirk's assassination, with people going back to church, I think at the very basic level, it confronted a lot of my generation with the reality that you're not going to live forever. You don't know when your life on this earth is done. Here's Charlie Kirk. He's 31 years old, a young man who has everything going for him, beautiful wife, beautiful kids, amazing life, and his life is cut short way too soon. And so it was really confronting, even for me as a Christian, that, wow, I don't have maybe as long as I think I do. I want to live every day for the glory of God, for his kingdom, and to try to have that as the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, that is so wise, Alyssa. And Stephen, thank you as well for just reminding us to, we really do have to think about this from a biblical perspective, because we are increasingly in a, as we talked about a lot for anybody who was listening in the last hour too, in many ways in a hostile culture, hostile to our beliefs that we hold as Christians, but how much more so Christians in other parts of the world, or Christians throughout church history, who were, and not just occasionally, but every single day being targeted and killed for nothing other than the fact that they professed faith in Jesus Christ. And yet, even in, and maybe even especially in those kinds of circumstances, you see the gospel spread, and you see the truly night and day life-changing impact that it has. So I think we need to remember that too, and take an evangelistic approach, because it's not just about politics. It's not just about our cultural ideologies. It really is about the truth of the gospel and being able to speak that out. And so encouraging each other with the biblical worldview and to stand boldly in that. But ultimately, we want to be setting that example and making disciples for Jesus Christ. So already just kicking off the first half of the hour with great conversation. We're about to go to a break, but when we come back, let's turn to some practical stuff, particularly housing policy. And the reason I want to talk about this on the roundtable today is because one of the biggest problems right now that we're facing is a drop in fertility. So if you want young people to be able to get married and have families, they have to have affordable housing to house those families. And so there is a bill that could potentially provide that in Congress right now, but it's falling a little bit short. We're going to explore that when we get back after this break.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
This is definitely an article that I recommend you read or follow along with online. You can find it at pointofview.net. It's from the Institute for Family Studies by Lyman Stone, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Prenatalism Initiative at Institute for Family Studies. And so he does a lot of really good research. I read the Institute for Family Studies a lot. And so his article that I want to talk about is Congress is quietly passing an anti-family housing bill. And bear with me as I try to go through some of the details here and as we talk about this, because there are a lot of numbers and statistics and charts, which is why I recommend you check out the article online. But in short, what's happened is that despite the government shutdown, Congress has been working to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, of course. And in that, the NDAA, it includes the Road to Housing Act, which was advanced by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. And the goal of that is to encourage more housing. And it is actually supported by both parties. It is being touted by Republicans as, pro-family, because, again, if you want to encourage more people to have families, then they need more affordable housing. And that is a big problem around the nation right now. But what Lyman Stone is arguing is that while the intentions are good and how this bill, while it will encourage more housing of a kind, it lacks the parameters to actually specifically encourage the kind of housing that families want, which is modestly sized single-family houses on modestly sized lots. So basically a neighborhood where you have a house and a yard. It doesn't have to be a huge house, but it's room for family. His argument, and we can get into some of the details in a minute, is that what this would do is really encourage more addresses, technically increase the number of homes in a city, but those would basically be studio apartments or just more high rises, not really conducive to family life. So, Stephen, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on this kind of issue, specifically housing, and what we might do to address it or advance more family-friendly policies that were going to have actual practical effects.
Yeah, I think I take a little bit of a different view on this. My view is this. We have more than enough houses, but we have too many people here. And what I mean by that is we have over 20 million illegal aliens here. Well, where do you think they're living? In houses. You're focusing on the wrong problem, trying to come up with a solution. You got to fix the real problem. Now, I think if you say, well, how do we deal with the housing thing? Because we're not going to deal with the illegal immigration thing. I think that's a whole different discussion. I like that they point out, like, hey, it's going to give you more units per person, but it's not going to give you more units for families to live in. And I think that's a problem with the act. I think the issue is when you try to do, and I love Tim Scott. I think he's a future vice president. I think if you look at the Trump successes of the first administration, it was all Tim Scott bills. He knows how to work across the aisle and get real things done. I love Tim Scott. So I don't want to hear anything, I'm not trying to say anything bad about Tim Scott. I think he did a good job with this bill. There's things that need to be corrected. But I think the issue here is it's a local problem that we're trying to fix at a federal level.
Yeah.
And I know where I live in Fairfax County, we don't need any more houses. Okay. We're full. I live in Fairfax. I'm like, hey, go out to Manassas, go out past Loudoun. We are full. We don't have space for anyone else to come. And I'm pretty sure people in Florida are screaming amen. But I think this is where the government is too big. The federal government is trying to fix a local problem and instead letting let locals fix their problem of housing affordability and housing issues. I think that's really what we're talking about here. And that's why even in this bill, like the article says, it's like, hey, you're not making these housing units, whether they're apartments or not. And I think that's the other part about it. It's like realistically, most people, especially where I live in Northern Virginia, you can only afford a condo. That's the only thing that's affordable unless you're a millionaire. How about making those condos 3-bedroom condos? Because you need to have a spot where you can raise 2 to 4 kids if we're going to do the replacement rate, right? And I think that is a legit criticism that the article points out of this bill that hopefully they can fix. But I think there's some other issues that's really the issue here that we're not facing because that would be a divide.
Yeah. Good points. And just a reminder, too, that even things that aren't related are, and one thing affects another, and that can make the political process very messy. I'm in North Texas, and so I'm right there with you with, hey, we're full right now. I mean, we're looking we're talking about the DFW area, and, listeners know if they're in this area, it's just going to go all the way up to the border of Oklahoma at some point. We've accepted it. That's what's happening. But yes, I do think you make a good point about localism too. And just to say as well, like I'm totally a fan of Senator Tim Scott as well. And I think that this, at the Institute for Family Studies specifically, they analyze this kind of stuff all the time. And so something that they mention, and if this people want to take action on this, during the conferencing process for this, you could contact your representative and say, hey, here are some concerns I have, because many people, including Senator Scott, may be pushing this forward thinking, hey, this is good. This is pro-family, but could we tweak a few things here and actually make it even more conducive to family homes? So that might be an action item too. But Alyssa, love to get your thoughts on this issue or responses to anything that Stephen said.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen with his point that illegal immigration has significantly damaged the housing market. But specifically in my area, my one point of pushback, and this might just be, to his point, a local issue, because in my area, it's a very expensive area. And most of the building projects that happen in this area are condos, townhomes, apartments. There aren't a lot of single-family homes. So my husband and I, we just purchased a single-family home this past June. But the fact that we were able to find a home in general that was on the market and not for an insane amount of money was honestly a miracle from God. So to the bill's downfall, I think that just creating more living areas is not really conducive to, I think, what an American family is looking for or needing. That even in this area, it's more ideal to have a single family home. People don't want condos. They don't want townhomes to raise their families in. They don't want to deal with HOAs and the politics that come with those and all these added on costs that they have. They just want to have a little bit of land, a basic house, and to be left alone, to be quite honest. And so when we found this place, we're like, sold. So that would be my point of pushback, that we do need more single family homes. We don't just need more places to live, especially if we're going to fight back, like Stephen said, against the fertility issue and going above replacement rate. We need to be able to have spaces that are conducive to raising a small family.
Yeah, and that's great to hear your perspective too, because I know that this is an issue that a lot of people, including people I know, are dealing with. We're having so much growth in my area, and it's interesting because people that I know or in my family who have been raised here and lived here their whole lives, all of a sudden they can't afford a home in the very area where they were raised. And, we're seeing a lot of building that's happening in my town, and a lot of it is apartments, which is frustrating. Also,
and it's same here. It's same here, right outside the nation's capital in Northern Virginia. I call our house Mosley Manor, but we're really in a condo because that's all you can afford. Like, only millionaires can afford we call it detached homes, right? Mm-hmm. Which growing up, it used to be just called a house.
Right.
No one can afford it. And I think that's the problem, is that we're not living better than our parents. Like, I grew up in a single family home inside of a neighborhood as middle class people whose houses probably cost less than $300,000. And goes really expensive today. Mm-hmm. I can't afford a house in Northern Virginia. I can't even afford a house in what people call Northern Virginia. That's well past Woodbridge, which is well out there. Yeah. Because of just how bad the economy is on houses, because there is a lack of inventory. But it's just one of those things that's like, it's just out of reach for most people. So, I say be content with what you have. And it's like, all right, well, this is what you can afford if you were going to live here. Like, if you're going to live in Northern Virginia, if you're not a millionaire, you're not getting a detached home. That's not a possibility for you. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be, if you're going to actually live on a budget. But other places in the country, it might be a place for you. But I really do believe that is for a local government to figure out. I think that the federal government trying to figure it out is having a lot of holes because each place is different.
Yeah. And, that's really another encouragement, too, to people to really get involved in local politics, because, Stephen, you're so right. We pay attention to what's going on in Congress and in Washington, D.C., and that matters, and we should be in contact with our representatives there in D.C., but we need to learn more about, what's happening here? What are developers looking at in my town, in my county? Who can I contact about that? How can I get involved? And that's so important. So I'm glad that we had the chance to highlight this, because it is such an important issue and so relevant for millennials and members of Gen Z right now who are, having young families, wanting to start a family, wanting to just be able to buy a home, a traditional marker of adulthood, a milestone that is just, like you said, Stephen, farther and farther out of reach for a lot of people. But we have a few more things to discuss when we come back, so stay with us. We'll be right back after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thanks again for being with us today on the Point of View Roundtable, where we have been discussing all kinds of things. And just to sort of round out our discussion on the housing issue and making sure that hopefully our nation is supporting family-friendly housing policies, I am thankful that this does seem to be something that the administration is thinking about. I know that Vice President J.D. Vance has said several things about the importance of pro-family policy. Now, I don't think that he gets everything right with some of the things that he suggests, or that the administration is getting everything right with what they put forward. But I hope and pray that that continues to be an ongoing conversation in the administration and in different levels of government, because we really, it's so vital. And again, just to reiterate what both Stephen and Alyssa were talking about, the issue of family-friendly policies, including housing, is maybe something that you never really thought of before, but it's very relevant now. So if you want to see more young people being able to get into homes, have more children, and have the space to do that, then get involved at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, and do what you can to advocate for policies that are going to be good for family. And again, I would recommend Institute for Family Studies to see kind of their research on that. On the note of, or continuing on the topic of family-friendly policy, I did want to turn to this article from the National Review. This is from the editors, and they talk about the moral stakes of Trump's IVF order. So last week, President Trump announced a new federal guideline on insurance coverage for IVF, or in vitro fertilization. And basically, the new system would make opting into fertility benefits similar to opting in for dental or vision benefits. So it's going to provide a lot of discounts for people who are seeking to have a child and are looking at IVF as their option. So I do want to approach this topic with sensitivity, because I know a lot of people have used IVF or have considered it. And again, when you are in a position as somebody who is wanting to have a child, and then you have had issues for whatever reason with infertility, then this does seem like a good option. A lot of pro-lifers have expressed some concerns with it, even if not all of the methods with the industry at large. So Alyssa, I'll turn to you first on this. What are your thoughts on President Trump's order, and kind of as pro-lifers, how we should think about his real advocacy for more accessible IVF?
Yeah, well, as someone who is pro-life, and most importantly, though, as someone who is a Christian, I have to filter everything, all the policies that the administration, any administration, it doesn't have to necessarily be Trump, I have to filter everything through the lens of Scripture. And the sad reality when it comes to IVF is that the IVF industry is more deadly to children than Planned Parenthood is. They kill more babies every year than Planned Parenthood. And it's not because of random chance either. It's very specific eugenics practices, because what happens is when parents go through the IVF process, you typically have more than one embryo that is created, because multiple eggs and multiple sperm are harvested from both the male and the female. However, most parents don't want more than one child, so they only want to implant one embryo. Well, what do you do with the other 10 or 11 embryos? Most of the time, parents decide to abort those or kill them. Sometimes they decide to have them donated to science for experimental purposes, which is extremely barbaric. And the other option is to pay a monthly fee, which is thousands of dollars every month, to keep them in a frozen ice type of situation, so that you can either keep them indefinitely, or you can harvest them at another time if you want to have more kids down the road. And we call those snowflake babies, which actually you can adopt, which is really cool. So from a pro-life and biblical perspective, I am against any kind of form of IVF, and I'm especially against forcing insurance companies to pay for those.
Stephen, what are your thoughts on this?
I think she did a great job of explaining IVF and its moral implications. And I'll say I have flipped on this. So when I first heard about this a couple of years ago, I was like, yeah, as long as it happens between a husband and a wife and they implant all these babies, I was like, we're good. And then I start to read more and find out that exactly what she has talked about is happening, is where people are not implanting all of them. And they're either giving them over to science, which means they're being destroyed, or they're freezing them forever and then eventually getting rid of them. So what that means for your listeners is that if you say you're pro-life, which most of us are, and I'm pro-life as a Christian, there are babies that are dying because we created them and then discarded them. It is the right-wing version of abortion. And that's sad, because we're known to be for life. Now, we used to say, don't abort, adopt. And I still believe we should be doing that. And you can still do that. But now, because of science, we're able to do something else called IVF. And because there is not a way to ensure the business side of doing this, there hasn't made a way for us to just implant one baby and only take one and know that that would be successful within the covenant of marriage. You have this alternative. And so you have to ask yourself, should I be playing God with this? And am I going to trust the Lord that when the time is right, he will give me a child, that I don't have to force my way through, that just like Abraham and Sarah, he will bring me a child of promise, but I don't have to do Abraham and Hagar. That is something we have to individually ask ourselves as believers. And I would encourage your audience to read the article, The Moral Stakes of Trump's IVF Order, that we're talking about from the National Review. If you're like, I really don't understand this issue, but I want to, it's a short article, and you will be up to speed if you read that article. My favorite part, though, is this. Ryan T. Anderson from the Ethics and Public Policy Center says, this was the least bad that we could come up and hope for when it came to the bill. He was like, yeah, this whole thing's bad, but this is actually the least bad. And so it's like, thanks, Ryan. Thanks for giving us at least that hope. I was like, hey, it could have been worse. The bill could have been worse.
Yeah. So again, great wisdom from both of you. And you can find this article at pointofview.net. And I know that this one is tough because so much of the industry we actually are learning more about. And it's not like elective abortion, which comes from a place of purposefully destroying a life that has been created. This comes from a place of wanting to have children and create life, which is, I think, why it can be hard for Christians and even pro-lifers. But again, if we are going to, as Alyssa said, really embody that biblical worldview, then we have to be honest with ourselves about the dangers of this. And there are even more eugenic implications, which we've discussed on Point of View before, and we will again, with regard to how science is, advancing all these things that are supposedly exciting, but are turning into people actually now testing and selecting their embryos based on things like genetic factors, how they want them to look, which sex of baby they want to have. So there are a lot of issues to consider here. And one more thing I'll mention real quick before we end is that, so much of the time I think we don't realize that industries like this are making money off of people's bodies not functioning correctly. Let's hope and pray and work alongside the people who are working with men and women to actually address the issues that they are having in marriage when they are wanting to have a child. There are so many things that could be done to help them have healthier lives and reproductive lives too that are often ignored for the sake of a big industry that makes a lot of money. But that's all the time we have for today. So if you again want to go read anything we've discussed, you can do that at pointofview.net. Also on pointofview.net, you can find information for Stephen and Alyssa, and I highly recommend you do that. You can click on their links and see the work that they are involved in. But both of you, thanks so much for being on Point of View today.
Ladies, so great to be with you all.
And again, thank you for listening to Point of View and being with us on the round table. Check out the resources that we have online. As Stephen was saying, lots of great food for thought. And don't forget to sign up for our Pray for America emails, because what we need to do for this nation is pray. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places, and some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.